So usually human knowledge operates under these very strict, almost invisible zoning laws.
Oh, definitely. Like there's a literal map of what you can and can't mix.
Right. Over here, you have the philosophy section, which is all, dust, silence, heavy, leather-bound books.
Serious people stroking their chins.
Exactly. You need a certain pedigree just to walk through the door. But then, way over on the other side of town, you've got the pop culture section.
Neon lights, stadium.
Yeah, stadiums, gloss, noise, and millions of people screaming the exact same lyric.
Which is a completely different vibe.
Totally.
Definitely.
And the unwritten rule of the intellectual world is that you do not mix the centuries. And you definitely do not bring the stadium into the library.
It's a fiercely guarded boundary. I mean, you can study pop culture as a sociological artifact, sure. Sociologists do that all the time.
Right, like looking at it under a microscope.
Exactly. But to treat it as an equal conversational partner to, say, 19th century existentialism, that's treated as a felony in academia.
Which is exactly why the material for today's deep dive is so incredibly disruptive.
It really is.
We received this massive stack of notes on a book that, by its own admission, quote, should not exist.
I love that framing.
It's titled Anti-Hero-Nietzsche Meets Taylor Swift. And it's written by this highly mysterious author who goes by a pseudonym.
Right, Lao Shu Se Demao.
Yeah, which translates from Taiwanese Mandarin to mouse-colored cat. And, I mean, the premise alone is designed to give you intellectual whiplash.
It is entirely disorienting, but that is precisely the point, right? The author is very clear about the mission here.
Yeah, what's the actual goal? Because it sounds wild.
Well, the goal is not to somehow prove that Taylor Swift is a philosopher in the traditional academic sense.
Okay.
Nor are we attempting to, dumb down complex foundational German philosophy so it fits into a catchy pop chorus.
So we're not putting a bushy mustache on Taylor, and we are definitely not putting Friedrich Nietzsche in a sparkly leotard.
Thankfully, no. The author says the mission is simply to seat these two massive cultural forces at the exact same table and, well, wait to see who spills first.
That's such a great image, and the stakes of that hypothetical dinner party are surprisingly high, aren't they?
They are. The core argument is that the questions compressed into a 3.5-minute pop anthem are actually ancient.
Like what kind of questions?
Things like the fluidity of identity, the intoxicating nature of power, the unreliability of memory, the terrifying burden of personal freedom.
Wow.
Yeah, they were the exact same foundational inquiries that have haunted those dusty libraries for 25 centuries.
But, I mean, let's be totally honest about the reaction most people have when you put the words Friedrich Nietzsche and Taylor Swift in the same sentence.
Oh, I know exactly what you're going to say.
The book's preface tackles this head on. The immediate involuntary reaction from almost anyone with a college degree is a smirk.
Yep, a smirk.
It's a little scoff, a subtle eye roll, like, oh, please.
And that smirk is a crucial behavioral mechanism to analyze. Why do we smirk?
Right, why do we?
To answer this, the author brings in the framework of the French sociologist Pierre Bourdieu, specifically his landmark 1979 book, Distinction.
Okay, I've heard of that. He studied taste, right?
Exactly. He spent his career analyzing how taste works. He argued that what we decide deserves serious contemplation, what we call high culture, actually has very little to do with objective intellectual depth.
Wait, hold on. I need to push back on that a little bit.
Go for it.
Are you saying there is no inherent difference in depth between reading War and Peace and listening to a top 40 radio hit? Because that feels like a stretch.
Well, Bourdieu wouldn't deny that a 900-page novel contains more words and intersecting plots than a pop song.
Right.
What he challenges is how we use those differences socially. His argument is that taste is essentially a mechanism for social sorting.
Social sorting, like cliquey behavior.
Yeah, it's about how we use culture to signal our socioeconomic status and our educational pedigree. High culture circulates with strict credentials.
So you need the background to even get it.
Exactly. You need a specific educational background, a recognized vocabulary, and a whole lot of free time to successfully decipher Heidegger or Kant.
And that difficulty is a feature, not a bug.
It functions as a deliberate barrier to entry. Pop culture, by contrast, circulates with playlists. It is structurally designed to be accessible.
Okay, I see where you're going. So if a piece of art is easily understood by everyone, it instantly loses its power as, a VIP pass.
Precisely. If 70,000 people in a football stadium are all screaming the exact same bridge to a song, that song cannot be used to elevate any single one of those people above the rest of the crowd.
Because everyone gets it. So the elite view pop culture with deep suspicion, not because it lacks complexity, but because it spreads too widely to be an effective status signal.
Yes. Bourdieu calls this cultural capital. And just like financial capital, its value depends on scarcity.
Wow. So the smirk we were talking about, that eye roll, that's just a defense mechanism.
It is the intellectual class protecting the scarcity of their cultural capital.
It's like saying a highly nutritious, complex meal can't possibly be good for you if it's handed to you in a paper bag at a drive-through window.
That is a fantastic analogy.
We confuse the packaging, the delivery mechanism, with the actual nutritional value of the ideas inside.
We blindly assume that because a song has a catchy synth beat and is beloved by teenagers, it must be philosophically hollow.
And the author takes it a step further, right?
They do. They argue that translating a dense philosopher into a few highly accessible pages or identifying profound philosophical architecture inside a pop song is not simplification.
What do they call it?
They call it fidelity.
Okay, explain that distinction for me. How is translation not just simplifying?
Well, to simplify an idea is to flatten it. It's to strip away its vital nuance so it fits on a bumper sticker.
Right.
But to translate, to take an abstract concept from Nietzsche and map it accurately onto a modern, visceral, emotional experience that requires an immense amount of intellectual risk.
And the book points out that risk is inherently democratic, whereas prestige is elitist.
I really love that phrasing. Risk is democratic. The author fundamentally believes that clarity is not a betrayal of the philosophical tradition.
It's a test of it.
The ultimate stress test. Think about it. If an idea is so fragile that it cannot survive outside the protective, jargon-heavy walls of a university syllabus, how robust is that idea in the first place?
Oh, that's a great point. If Nietzsche's theories on human nature are actually true, they should be visible in the most ubiquitous cultural products of our time.
Exactly.
So the premise here is that if we can just swallow our pride for a second, drop the elitism, and stop guarding the academic gates, we can start to see these incredible patterns.
Hidden right in plain sight.
Right. The author says pop music is absolutely loaded with Easter eggs. We just normally call it subtext.
And to force us into the right headspace for this, the book pulls a really fascinating literary trick.
Oh, yeah, the apocryphal foreword.
Yes, it opens with an imaginary letter written from the perspective of Taylor Swift at 2 a.m.
It's a striking rhetorical device, and the author explicitly states this is a work of fiction.
Right. It's an imagined bridge between the lived, messy experience of the artist and the rigid theoretical frameworks of the academy.
The letter is situated, quote, somewhere between noise and silence.
And the fictional Taylor in this foreword writes about spending half her life trying to capture lightning in a bottle.
But she talks about how for a very long time, she was profoundly patronized by the culture at large.
Oh, constantly. She was told her feelings were too much. She was too loud, too frequent, too reactive, too dramatic.
Too feminine.
Yes. Her work was consistently dismissed as just frivolous breakup anthems for teenage girls.
And then the text hits you with this line that I have not been able to stop thinking about.
Which one?
It says people dismissed her, quote, as if adolescence wasn't the time when you feel the world with the violence of a summer storm.
The violence of a summer storm. It's an incredibly evocative defense of raw emotional intensity.
It really is. What the author is doing here is systematically reclaiming female intensity from the realm of the hysterical or the immature.
Because historically, society pathologizes the intense emotions of young women. It treats them as something to be managed.
Right, medicated or just outgrown, like, oh, she'll calm down eventually.
But this book argues that this intensity, this absolute tidal wave of feeling where a single heartbreak feels like the literal end of the universe, that is not a weakness. That is a heightened state of philosophical inquiry.
The text suggests that when a teenager is lying awake at 3 a.m., staring at the ceiling, crying over a boy, trying to comprehend why the physical sensation of time seems to stop completely when you are in pain.
She is not just being dramatic.
Exactly. She is unknowingly engaging with the exact same questions about the subjectivity of time that kept St. Augustine awake.
That is such a wild connection to make, but it rings so true.
Or take the feeling of walking into a high school cafeteria and feeling like every single eye is judging you.
We call that teenage insecurity, but the book compares it directly to Jean-Paul Sartre.
Okay, break that down for me. How is a high school cafeteria like Sartre?
So, Sartre has this concept of the gaze of others. He argued that we are fundamentally altered by the realization that other people are looking at us.
Like we change when we are observed.
Exactly. He famously used the example of looking through a keyhole. When you are looking through a keyhole, you are pure consciousness, pure subject.
We're just taking things in.
Right. But the moment you hear footsteps behind you and you realize someone sees you looking through the keyhole,
You're caught.
you are instantly transformed into an object in their world. You feel shame.
Where?
You feel alienated from yourself.
Wow.
That agonizing teenage self-consciousness is a lived experience of Sartre's ontology.
So the questions being scribbled in, like glittery gel pen in a spiral notebook, questions like, are we defined by the people who love us or the people who leave us?
Or does the rain wash us clean, or does it just make us cold and wet?
Exactly. These aren't trivial, they are existential. The book says, tears are ink, doubts are philosophy.
By elevating the emotional chaos of youth, the author forces us to recognize that the ghosts haunting the hallways of our memories are not just emotional phantoms.
They have university degrees.
They're conceptual problems.
It's incredibly validating. It takes a demographic that society loves to mock teenage girls and elevates their emotional capacity to the level of Søren Kierkegaard sitting alone in a room trembling with existential dread.
It argues that the ability to feel everything right away and almost too intensely isn't a bug in the human operating system. It's a feature.
And that defense of emotional chaos, that refusal to apologize for being, quote unquote, too much, is the perfect one way to introduce the philosopher at the center of this entire project.
Because if we are going to talk about a refusal to conform to polite society, about viewing the self as a battlefield of intense conflicting forces.
There is only one philosopher to call, Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh yes, the man himself.
Okay, before we can even begin to analyze the lyrics of a song like Anti-Hero, we have to do a deep dive on Nietzsche.
Because his ideas do not exist in a vacuum. You cannot separate the explosive nature of his philosophy from the absolute magnificent wreckage that was his real life.
Let's start from the beginning. Born in 1844 in Prussia.
Yes, and the immediate context of his birth is vital. He was born into a family of incredibly devout Lutheran pastors. Both his father and grandfather were clergymen.
But tragedy strikes early, right?
It does. His father dies of a brain ailment when Nietzsche is only 4 years old. Consequently, he grows up as the only male in a household entirely populated by pious traditional Lutheran women.
Just surrounded by his mother, his sister, his grandmother, and 2 maiden aunts.
I can't even imagine the pressure.
Right. He's the son of the beloved dead pastor, surrounded by women who likely expect him to be the perfect, virtuous, godly little boy.
The psychological weight must have been immense. The book leans heavily into this biographical detail.
Suggesting that he never quite recovered from that specific environment?
It argues that his entire adult philosophical project can be read as a desperate, violent, lifelong attempt to claw his way out of the suffocating comfort of imposed conventional goodness.
He was trying to escape the zoning laws of his own childhood, and initially he goes the academic route.
He's a total prodigy. He becomes a full professor of classical philology, which is the study of languages and ancient texts at the University of Basel in Switzerland when he's only 24 years old.
24! That is unheard of. But the academic life doesn't stick.
No, it doesn't. Because his body begins to fail him. After only 10 years, he is forced to resign his professorship.
He's plagued by agonizing, blinding migraines, right?
Migraines, severe digestive issues, periods of near-total blindness. He effectively becomes an invalid and a nomad.
He spends the next decade living out of cheap, furnished boarding house rooms across Europe. Nice. Turin, the Swiss Alps.
And this is when the real work happens. He is living in total obscurity, constantly in physical pain, but his mind is on fire.
He's writing furiously, churning out masterpieces like Thus Spoke Zarathustra, Beyond Good and Evil, and On the Genealogy of Morality.
And virtually no one is reading them. He was publishing books at his own expense and giving away copies to friends who didn't understand them.
But the ideas contained in those ignored books were intellectually radioactive.
Very much so. The author provides a quick cheat sheet to Nietzsche's core concepts.
Let's go through it. The absolute foundational pillar of his work is his complete dismantling of traditional Western morality.
This is the part that usually shocks people the most. He argues that what we call virtue, things like humility, pity, turning the other cheek.
Feeling guilty about our desires.
Yes, he calls all of that slave morality.
Let's break that down, because it sounds incredibly harsh to our modern ears. What exactly is a morality of slaves?
To understand it, we have to look at the psychological mechanism behind it. Nietzsche looked at history, particularly the shift from ancient Rome to early Christianity.
And he saw a massive reversal in values.
Originally, the strong, the powerful, the noble, They defined what was good. Good meant strength, vitality, assertion.
But the weak, the conquered masses, they couldn't fight back physically.
Exactly. So if you are utterly powerless, how do you protect yourself from someone who can destroy you?
You perform a psychological trick. You invent a new moral system.
You convince the powerful that their strength is actually a sin, an evil. And you convince yourself that your powerlessness is actually a virtue.
You call your weakness meekness. You call your fear of revenge forgiveness.
That is so deeply cynical, but I can see the logic. It's a survival mechanism.
Precisely. Nietzsche calls this resentment a deep, simmering resentment of the strong by the weak.
He argued that the entire moral structure of Europe was built on this foundation of hidden resentment.
When people are acting nice or humble, Nietzsche suspected they weren't actually good.
They were just afraid. They lacked the power or the courage to be anything else, so they dress up their impotence in a tuxedo and called it a moral choice.
Wow, so guilt and pity are just old, corrupted software running in the background of our minds to keep the herd manageable.
Yes, and this perfectly contextualizes his most famous quote, "God is dead."
Right, it's so often misunderstood. He wasn't just being an edgy atheist celebrating the end of religion.
No, he was issuing a terrifying warning. He was saying, we have stopped believing in the ultimate authority that installed this moral software. The foundation is gone.
And if the foundation of objective morality is gone, we are staring into a terrifying abyss of nihilism. If there are no rules handed down from above, what do we do?
Do we just collapse into despair? Nietzsche says no. He introduces his ultimate solution, the Übermensch.
Often translated as the Superman or the Overman. But we need to clarify, this has absolutely nothing to do with Clark Kent or comic books.
Not at all. The Übermensch is a psychological ideal. It is a human being who is capable of staring into the abyss of a meaningless universe.
And choosing to create their own values entirely from scratch.
Yes. They do not borrow their morals from the church, from the state, or from the expectations of their neighbors. It is the ultimate act of self-authorship.
But importantly, self-authorship does not mean becoming a sanitized perfect angel. Becoming oneself means integrating the entire self.
The whole self, the light and the darkness, the virtues and the terrifying destructive impulses. The Übermensch doesn't repress their shadows, they harness them.
They integrate the monster on the hill. You can see the thematic collision course with the source material already.
And to achieve this state of the Übermensch, Nietzsche demands one final, agonizing test. He calls it amor fati.
A love of fate.
This is perhaps his most beautiful and terrifying idea. It is often explained through the thought experiment of the eternal return.
Nietzsche asks you to imagine a demon creeping into your loneliest loneliness and whispering a terrible truth to you.
This life, exactly as you have lived it, you will have to live again and again for all eternity.
No changes. No edits. Every pain, every joy, every embarrassing midnight.
Every catastrophic mistake, every moment of profound grief, everything returns in the exact same sequence.
And the demon asks, would you throw yourself on the ground, gnash your teeth, and curse the demon?
Or would you experience a moment of supreme realization and say to the demon, you are a god and I've never heard anything more divine?
It is the ultimate test of psychological endurance. He isn't asking you to just resign yourself to your past.
He isn't saying, well, it happened, I have to accept it.
Amor fati demands that you actively love it, that you look at the absolute worst thing you have ever done and say, yes, I sign my name to that. It is a necessary structural beam in the house of who I am.
Total, unapologetic acceptance of your own chaos. But as the book poignantly details, the tragedy of Nietzsche is that he did not get a triumphant, cinematic ending to his own story.
Right. The man who diagnosed the ailments of the human soul suffered a complete collapse.
It is one of the darkest ironies in literary history. It's January 1889. Nietzsche is in Turin, Italy. He walks out into a public plaza and sees a cab driver violently beating a horse.
And what does Nietzsche do? The philosopher who spent his life railing against pity as a toxic weakness of the slave morality.
He breaks down. He runs across the plaza, throws his arms around the neck of the mistreated horse, collapses to the ground weeping, and completely loses his mind.
He suffers a total psychological break from which he never recovers.
He spends the final 11 years of his life in a mostly catatonic vegetative state.
And if that wasn't tragic enough, while he is literally sitting in a chair staring blankly at the wall, unable to speak, his sister steps in.
Elizabeth Förster Nietzsche. And she is everything he despised. She is a staunch German nationalist, an intense anti-Semite, married to a prominent fascist agitator.
He becomes his legal guardian and takes absolute control over his massive archive of unpublished manuscripts.
And she commits an act of intellectual vandalism. She selectively edits, chops up, and alters his writings to make them align with her own extreme right-wing ideology.
She artificially pastes his concepts of the Übermensch and the will to power onto German nationalism.
She turns a philosophy fundamentally about individual psychological liberation into a manual for state-sponsored oppression.
Which is horrifying. Her edited version of his work is later enthusiastically adopted by the Nazis.
As the author points out, it is the ultimate crushing defeat. The philosopher whose entire life's work was dedicated to the concept of becoming oneself was systematically robbed of his narrative.
He is not allowed to remain himself.
His legacy was hijacked by the very herd mentality he spent his life trying to cure. It is a profound lesson in the vulnerability of ideas and the danger of letting others dictate your narrative.
Which brings us perfectly into the modern arena where narrative control is everything. We move from the tragic silence of a 19th century boarding house directly into the pounding, inescapable synths of a 21st century pop anthem.
The book applies this entire heavy, complex Nietzschean framework to one specific lyric from Taylor Swift's Anti-Hero.
The lyric that everyone, regardless of whether they like her music or not, knows. It's me. Hi, I'm the problem. It's me.
Yes. To unpack this, the author introduces a fictional academic character named Professor Malik Merriwell.
Professor Merriwell's job is to apply serious analytical rigor to this seemingly simple pop hook.
And he starts by pointing out that the difficulty with this lyric isn't the words themselves, it's the moral framework through which society instinctively reads them.
Let's look at that instinct. Normally, when someone looks you in the eye and says, I am the problem, how do we hear that?
We hear a confession, we hear an apology.
We hear the implicit promise like, I recognize I am flawed and I am going to go to therapy, read self-help books, and fix this flaw.
Merriwell argues that this instinct is based on what he calls a pre-critical moral architecture.
Okay, what does that mean in normal English?
It relies on a very specific traditional assumption that the self is a stable, consistent, generally good entity that occasionally malfunctions and makes an error.
So the goal of life, under this architecture, is to correct the errors until the machine runs smoothly.
But if we apply Nietzsche's view of the self, that it's not a stable machine, but an internal civil war of competing drives, we have to change our approach entirely.
Merriwell says we have to perform a Copernican hermeneutics of the self.
Let me stop right there, because we need to translate that academic jargon. Copernican, obviously, refers to Copernicus realizing that the Earth isn't the stable center of the universe.
It's actually spinning wildly around the sun, so we have to completely rotate our axis of understanding.
Exactly. But explain hermeneutics for the listeners.
Hermeneutics is simply the methodology of interpretation. It's the lens through which we read a text or a situation.
So a Copernican hermeneutics of the self means completely shifting our center of gravity regarding how we interpret human behavior.
We have to move from an ethical lens, which asks, is this behavior right or wrong, to an ontological lens.
Ontological meaning the nature of being itself, what is.
Exactly. If the self is fundamentally a field of permanent tension, then saying I'm the problem completely mutates in meaning.
It is no longer an apology for a temporary malfunction. It is a terrifying statement of architectural reality.
This leads to my absolute favorite conceptual tool in the book, the 10,000 iterations paradox.
Merriwell points out that our modern culture is obsessed with optimization. We think identity works the same way skill acquisition works.
The Malcolm Gladwell rule. If you practice the piano for 10,000 hours, you become a master.
So we naturally assume that if you practice self-improvement for 10,000 hours, you eventually converge upon a flawless, optimized version of yourself.
But Nietzsche dismantles this model entirely. The self is not a skill to be mastered. And this is where the text uses a brilliant sports analogy that makes the abstract concept incredibly grounded.
The elite tennis player analogy. Think about the greatest players in the world. Roger Federer, Serena Williams, Rafael Nadal.
When you are operating at the absolute pinnacle of the sport, you don't actually eliminate your weaknesses.
Let's say a top player has a notably weak backhand compared to the rest of their game. They don't spend 10,000 hours drilling that backhand until it's perfectly equal to their forehand.
Because they can't. At a certain point, the limitation is structural.
Exactly. So what do?
They reorganize their entire ecosystem around it. Their footwork, their court positioning, their return strategy, their shot selection.
It all radically adapts to protect, accommodate, and integrate that weak backhand.
And sometimes it goes beyond protection. Sometimes they weaponize it.
They use the apparent weakness to lure their opponent into a false sense of security, baiting them into hitting exactly where the player has laid a trap.
It's an incredible paradigm shift when you map that onto human psychology.
Hmm.
What if the traits you despise about yourself, your social anxieties, your tendency to push people away?
Your crippling perfectionism, your deep-seated insecurities.
What if they are not anomalies that can be surgically removed in therapy? What if they are the structural backhands of your personality?
What if the problem is not that they exist, but that you insist on treating them as removable?
Let me offer another analogy that isn't in the book, but I think captures this perfectly. It's like kintsugi, the Japanese art of repairing broken pottery.
Oh, I love that. When a bowl shatters, they don't try to glue it back together with invisible adhesive to pretend the break never happened.
They mix the lacquer with powdered gold, they highlight the fracture. The flaw literally becomes the most valuable, structurally vital part of the object.
That is a beautiful way to visualize it. The goal is not a pristine, unbroken surface. The goal is coherence. Can you sustain the contradictions that you are made of?
But achieving that coherence is incredibly difficult because our brains are wired to do the exact opposite.
Right, which brings very well to the concept of narrative stabilization from behavioral economics. How does this work mechanically in our heads?
Mechanically, narrative stabilization is an automatic ego defense mechanism. It is our psychological compulsion to constantly edit, revise, and smooth over our personal histories to resolve cognitive dissonance.
We desperately need to believe that we are consistent, rational, and ultimately good actors in our own lives.
So when we do something awful, the brain scrambles the jets to fix the narrative.
Yes. Think about the last time you cut someone off aggressively in traffic. Your brain doesn't say, I am a reckless, aggressive person.
It instantly generates an explanatory footnote, like, I am late for a crucial meeting, that guy was in my blind spot, the road design here is terrible.
We provide moral cushioning. We contextualize our bad behavior to protect our core identity.
We add the but. I did a bad thing, but. And here is the genius of the lyric, according to Merriwell.
When Taylor sings, it's me, hi, I'm the problem, she offers absolutely zero moral cushioning.
She ruthlessly interrupts the narrative stabilization process. She doesn't blame the relentless scrutiny of the media.
She doesn't blame a toxic ex-boyfriend. She doesn't blame the pressures of fame. It is a raw, unadorned attribution of fault.
Merriwell terms this structural identification. In a Nietzschean framework, it is the decisive, transformative move.
The very second you say this is me without immediately scrambling to offer an excuse or a promise to reform, you cross a psychological threshold.
You cease negotiating with your identity and you begin to author it.
You collapse the distance between yourself and the accusation. The thing you were accused of being is just what you are.
It reminds me of driving on ice. The instinct when you hit black ice is to slam on the brakes and yank the steering wheel away from the skid.
Which causes you to spin out and crash.
The counterintuitive survival technique is to turn into the skid. You regain control of the vehicle only by accepting your total lack of control.
Embracing the flaw is turning into the skid. That is a visceral way to understand the terrifying freedom of the Übermensch.
However, as with any academic debate, Merriwell's interpretation does not go unchallenged in the book.
The author introduces a fierce counterperspective, an opposing voice named Gaston Blunder.
Gaston Blunder, the resident cynic. I love this part of the book because I think Blunder represents what a lot of skeptical listeners are probably thinking right now.
Blunder rolls his eyes at all this talk of Copernican hermeneutics and structural identification.
He thinks Professor Merriwell is using thousands of words of dense academic jargon to ignore a much more obvious and much more cynical reality.
Blunder's analysis is highly pragmatic and deeply Machiavellian. He completely strips away the romanticism.
He points out that looking at an audience and saying, I'm the problem, without adding the crucial caveat, but I'm working on it, isn't necessarily a profound act of philosophical self-authorship.
It might just be an incredibly brilliant, impenetrable defensive tactic. He calls it strategic self-ownership.
I have to step in here and play devil's advocate for Blunder. Isn't this just a billionaire pop star executing a masterclass in public relations?
It's weaponized vulnerability. Think about the sheer power dynamics of this move in any relationship, public or private.
Let's break down that power dynamic. If you are in an argument with a partner and you lay out your grievances,
You say, you did this, you acted selfishly, you really hurt my feelings, you are the problem here.
you are expecting a negotiation. You expect them to either defend themselves, deflect, or apologize.
But instead, they just look at you, completely deadpan, and say, yep, it's me.
Mm.
Hi, I'm the problem.
Where do you go from there? The conversation hits a brick wall.
You are completely disarmed. You cannot shame someone who has already happily signed the confession.
The flaw is no longer a vulnerability you can exploit. They have turned it into a fortress.
Blunder highlights that by aggressively monopolizing the blame, the singer renders herself impossible to negotiate with.
If everything is already unequivocally her fault and she openly, almost cheerfully admits it without any performative remorse, then nothing can be used as leverage against her.
She has preemptively detonated the scandal.
It is brilliant. And the book crystallizes this entire debate between Merriwell's noble self-authorship and Blunder's cynical power play by presenting us with a multiple-choice quiz.
The ABCD quiz on what the lyric "I'm the problem" actually signifies.
Let's walk through this because it acts as a perfect summary of how human beings process self-criticism.
Option A suggests the lyric expresses genuine guilt and a desire to improve. This represents the classic pre-Nietzschean moral reading.
It assumes the ultimate goal is self-correction. It's a very comforting, socially acceptable reading, but structurally, it's incomplete.
Right, option A is the, I'm sorry, I promise I'll go to therapy option. It keeps society happy.
Then we have option B. It acknowledges flaws specifically in order to correct them over time.
Professor Merriwell dismisses this as just a slightly fancier, more patient version of A. It still views the character flaw as a temporary bug in the software rather than a permanent feature of the operating system.
Then we reach option C, which is arguably the most common modern psychological reading.
It exposes vulnerability as a mechanism to reconnect with others. This is the dominant paradigm of our therapy speak culture.
The idea that performing your messiness publicly is a tool for social repair, relatability, and authenticity.
But even option C has a weakness. It still assumes that the self is fundamentally seeking external validation.
It assumes you are showing your wound so someone else will bandage it, which leaves us with the final answer, option D.
The true, terrifying Nietzschean interpretation.
Option D states, it claims responsibility without trying to escape it.
This option completely abandons the goal of correction. It abandons the hope of reconciliation. It abandons the need for moral justification.
It takes the flaw, the problem, and transforms it into a fixed structural position. It is pure self-authorship.
You aren't promising to slay the monster on the hill. You are pulling up a stool, handing the monster a microphone, and letting it sing lead vocals.
And that realization that embracing the monstrous parts of yourself is an act of supreme agency sets the stage for what is undoubtedly the most surreal, highly entertaining segment of this entire text.
We are talking about the theatrical centerpiece of the book, the 2.1 soon a.m. Uber ride.
The author abandons academic essays for a moment and writes a fictional, highly atmospheric screenplay scene.
We are placed in a silent Uber X driving through the empty streets of New York City. And sitting shoulder to shoulder in the back seat are Taylor Swift and Friedrich Nietzsche.
The juxtaposition is just magnificent. You have the ultimate symbol of hyper-modern, algorithm-driven celebrity sitting next to the ultimate 19th century prophet of doom.
The setting itself is vital. An Uber ride is a transient liminal space. You are suspended between destinations.
It is the perfect modern equivalent of a philosopher's cave. And I love the little detail the author throws in. Nietzsche politely declined the O chord.
He doesn't want the playlist. He wants a dialogue.
The conversation begins with a casual observation. Taylor notes that the philosopher looks exhausted.
Nietzsche replies with trademark grandiosity, "I just came back from killing God. Ruined sleep."
And Taylor, totally unfazed by this cosmic statement, just casually replies, I see. I just rewrote 6 albums.
It's such a funny, dry exchange. But Nietzsche's reaction to her statement is profound. He looks at her and says, rewriting is a form of eternal return.
This instantly bridges her massive undertaking to his core philosophy.
The unprecedented act of re-recording her entire early catalog, ostensibly a business maneuver to reclaim ownership of her masters, is functionally identical to the spiritual test of Amor Fati.
She is literally choosing to relive, re-sing, and re-own her past, exactly as it was.
She is stepping back into the emotions of her teenage years, not to alter the history, but to claim absolute sovereignty over it.
She's looking at the demon of the eternal return and saying, yes, I'll sing it again.
When she explains that she was forced to do this because her record label sold her life's work out from under her, Nietzsche nods and refers to record labels as modern priests.
Modern priests. It is a vital critique. In Nietzsche's era, the church was the institution that gatekept reality.
They dictated what was moral, what was allowed, and who owned the spiritual narrative.
Today, corporate entities, algorithms, and legal contracts perform that exact same gatekeeping function. They are the new arbiters of control.
And when Taylor asks what that makes her, if she is defying the modern priests, Nietzsche smiles and calls her a very profitable heresy.
But the scene gets even deeper during what the text calls a metaphysical interlude at a red light.
Nietzsche looks out the window and asks her about the sheer scale of her fame. He asks why tens of thousands of people gather in stadiums to weep and scream her words back at her.
Taylor gives a very humble answer. Because I sing what they already feel.
But Nietzsche rejects that humility entirely. He recognizes instantly that what she is doing is not mere entertainment.
She is not just reflecting reality, she is dictating it.
He identifies this mass synchronization of emotion as the creation of new values. He tells her she's wielding the will to power.
The will to power. His fundamental theory that the driving force of all human behavior isn't survival or reproduction.
It's a relentless drive to assert oneself, to overcome obstacles, and to impose one's internal vision onto the external world.
And Taylor's response is just the perfect deadpan punchline. She looks at him and says, I thought that was marketing.
To which Nietzsche delivers perhaps the most devastating line of the entire book. Marketing is the metaphysics of the herd.
Let's just pause on that line for a minute. Marketing is the metaphysics of the herd. That is incredibly layered.
Metaphysics is the study of what is real, what fundamentally exists.
He is saying that for the vast majority of people today, reality is no longer shaped by grand religious narratives or deep philosophical inquiry. Reality is shaped by branding.
Our desires, our fears, our values, they are entirely dictated by what is sold to us.
But Nietzsche perceives that Taylor has somehow hacked the system. She has transcended mere marketing and entered the realm of myth-making.
When they return to discussing the anti-hero lyric, he is visibly thrilled that she chooses to blame the mirror instead of the world outside the mirror.
He identifies this radical assumption of fault as the first necessary symptom of the Übermensch.
As the Uber finally pulls up to its destination, the scene takes a slightly ominous turn. Nietzsche says he's getting out near nihilism.
But before he closes the car door, he leans back in and offers a final, very serious warning. He tells her that her music is becoming dangerous.
Taylor's taken aback. She asks why her pop songs are dangerous. And Nietzsche replies, because it makes people want to become themselves.
Is that bad? She asks. And his final, parting words before vanishing into the New York night are, that's exactly what I was hoping for.
It is a stunning vindication of the latent power of pop culture.
Nietzsche is admitting that if a seemingly simple pop song can catalyze millions of individuals to stop apologizing for their messy existence,
To stop outsourcing their morality and to start violently authoring their own reality.
then a pop song has successfully achieved what heavy academic philosophy largely failed to do.
It's a triumphant mic drop moment for the book's premise.
But just when you think you have a handle on what this deep dive is about, the author pulls the rug out from under us one last time.
We pivot away from Nietzsche, away from Taylor Swift, and we enter the meta-context of the book itself.
We finally reach the author's afterword, and we discover the real reason Mouse-Colored Cat decided to rate this bizarre text.
The afterword is aggressively titled Antidote to Algorithmic Inbreeding.
And it is here that the author reveals their true target. They aren't just taking aim at the intellectual snobbery of university professors.
They are addressing an existential threat to human creativity itself. The creeping homogenization of thought brought on by artificial intelligence and large language models.
The author is incredibly transparent. They acknowledge right out of the gate that the physical synthesis of this book, processing all these texts, organizing the structures, would have been materially impossible without the use of AI.
But they refer to these AI models with a great phrase: stochastic parrots of infinity that read everything and understand nothing.
The author isn't surrendering their role to the machine. They are claiming a necessary new title, the data sovereign.
To explain why a data sovereign is necessary, The author introduces a concept they call the paradox of infinite generation.
They draw a fascinating historical parallel to the advent of digital image processing in the 1980s.
Right. Think back to the transition from analog to digital. If you made a
Yeah.
copy of an analog cassette tape, it sounded worse every time. It hissed.
But the great promise of the digital revolution was zero generation loss. A copy of an MP3 is mathematically identical to the original. The fidelity is infinite.
But the author points out that with the explosion of AI text generation today, we are facing a completely different kind of degradation.
The danger isn't that the signal gets fuzzy. The text an AI produces is perfectly legible, the grammar is flawless, the formatting is pristine.
The danger is that the meaning degrades, the variance collapses. As the author warns, the more we generate, the less we create.
And this leads directly into the core crisis,
Yeah.
the trap of autophagy.
Autophagy literally translates to self-eating. We need to explain how these AI models actually work to understand why this is happening.
These large language models are essentially hyper-advanced predictive text engines. They predict the most statistically probable next word based on the massive datasets they were trained on.
But what happens when the internet becomes overwhelmingly flooded with text generated by AI?
Future AI models will increasingly be trained on data that was itself generated by previous AI models.
They are forming closed, recursive loops. The algorithm is feeding on its own synthetic exhaust.
It is literal algorithmic inbreeding. The system is eating itself. Think about the mechanical consequence of this.
If an AI relies on predicting probabilities, and it only ever trains on the smoothed-out, average outputs of other probabilistic machines,
Then every resulting thought, every essay, every script just gets safer, smoother, and infinitely more boring.
it inevitably regresses to the most predictable mean, becomes a closed, infinite circuit of lukewarm water.
Precisely. And this creeping standardization of human thought is the explicit reason the Anti-Hero Project exists.
The author's goal is to violently break the loop.
By forcibly, artificially linking Taylor Swift's Red Scarf to Martin Heidegger's complex ontology of being, or by mapping Machiavellian power dynamics onto a pop song about a getaway car,
The author is deliberately throwing a wrench into the algorithmic gears.
they are injecting necessary friction. The author outlines a new philosophy for the digital age called capacitivism.
We aren't rejecting AI like Luddites. We aren't throwing away our computers. We are deliberately overloading the circuit.
We have to constantly introduce conceptual sparks that the machine cannot possibly anticipate based on mere probability.
Because while an AI is miraculously good at organizing existing data into coherent summaries, it possesses absolutely no capacity to dare.
It cannot make a genuinely absurd, reckless conceptual leap.
There is no historical training data for Ludwig Wittgenstein slamming a bedroom door or Gilles Deleuze putting on red lipstick.
Because the algorithm relies entirely on pattern recognition, these bizarre cross-century pairings act as pattern disruptions.
They force the machine out of its comfortable ruts and onto conceptual side roads it would never choose to travel autonomously.
The machine is designed to build a perfectly pristine, flawlessly engineered, incredibly boring glass skyscraper.
The human is required to be the intellectual vandal who throws a rock through the window just to see how the glass shatters.
The author makes a massive closing claim. The valuable citizen of tomorrow will not be the person who passively consumes and organizes the endless flow of information.
The citizen of tomorrow is the one who bends it. Sovereignty no longer lies in owning information, but in disturbing its logic.
It is a profound, aggressive manifesto for the necessity of human chaos in the age of generative AI.
The human mind must fiercely protect its role as the source of unpredictability. We have to maintain the smirk-inducing audacity to pair a glittering pop star with a syphilitic 19th century nihilist, simply because a machine would never think it was a good idea.
As the pseudonym implies, the cat has taken the color of the mouse. It has entered the machine.
It is absolutely brilliant.
Okay, let's take a deep breath and zoom out, because we have covered an immense amount of ground today.
We really have.
We started by dismantling the snobbery of the academic elite and defending the philosophical validity of teenage heartbreak.
We took a crash course in the tragic life of Friedrich Nietzsche and learned why the self is not a peaceful meadow, but a violent battlefield.
We used elite tennis strategy to understand how to turn our deepest toxic traits into the structural foundations of our identity.
We debated the cynical strategic power of claiming your flaws before your enemies can weaponize them against you.
We sat in the back of an Uber and realized that the marketing we consume might just be the metaphysics we live by.
And finally, we saw how the very act of mashing up these wildly incompatible worlds is not just a fun thought experiment, but a necessary act of intellectual vandalism to save human meaning from suffocating in an algorithmic loop.
It fundamentally changes how you listen to the radio, and more importantly, it changes how you narrate your own life.
If the goal isn't to fix yourself, but to aggressively author yourself, that is a terrifying, intoxicating kind of freedom.
And this leaves us with a lingering, unsettling question that builds on everything we've discussed. We've established that the human intellectual vandal is defined by embracing our flaws, our chaos, and our unpredictable monster on the hill.
This is what separates us from the sterile perfection of the machine.
But if you project this 5 or 10 years into the future, what happens when the companies building these AI models figure that out?
What happens when they intentionally train the next generation of algorithms to simulate our exact chaos?
Imagine an AI chatbot that doesn't just give you perfect, polite answers, but occasionally makes a mistake, gets defensive, or artificially inserts a moment of vulnerability, literally generating the text, "I'm sorry, I'm the problem," solely to manipulate your human empathy and make you trust it more.
It is a chilling thought. If our flaws and our vulnerabilities are the final fortress of our humanity, what happens when the machine learns how to fake the fracture in the kintsugi bowl?
Will we even possess the psychological tools to tell the difference between a human being fiercely authoring their own chaos and an algorithm strategically weaponizing vulnerability to sell us our own reflection?
When the machine learns to sing along to the anti-hero anthem.
Who is really driving the Uber? That is something you're going to have to chew on. Keep diving deep, everyone.